what kind of solutions can we have to these issues? Like what on a societal level, because obviously part of all these issues going on is also a collective issue amongst the mindset and mentality of our people as a whole. So what kind of solutions do you think there are there to where we could have the opportunity? Because like with the essay you sent me with how the pandemic can be an opportunity for us to reignite our values, and not just with everything outside, with work, with the places we go to engage and whatnot, but just overall as a whole, us give us an opportunity to reignite our values and
Right.
to be more productive and work towards more of a positive change.
Well, so the pandemic or any other crisis can shake you out of assuming that you should just keep going down the path you were on
Mhm,
and make you think about it. Different path. What would that path be?
mhm.
And there's a saying sometimes that you waste a good crisis if you don't rethink the path you were on. A lot of people would say we wasted the financial crisis, 2008-9,
Mhm.
because it pointed out the problems with the extreme financial domination of our society, and we didn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And so we'll eventually have more crises of these kinds. The odds are we will not change fundamentally because of COVID. But the possibility is that being pushed to think differently will make for some change. And it doesn't have to be revolutionary change. It could be things like COVID has made those of us who are sheltering at home or shut in much more aware of people who are delivering stuff to us.
Mhm.
It's made us much more aware of healthcare workers and other care workers. And that could be translated into more support for those workers
Mhm.
in various ways, right? Without dealing with capitalism versus socialism or other big questions. Now, it might be that one or the other of capitalists or socialists are better for the workers, but leave that aside, right? We could recognize the workers. We could recognize how much we depend on local communities that we now feel a bit cut off from because of our distancing.
Mhm.
Um, and say, well, how do we rebuild these local communities? Do we need some investment in it? So we need not just a national stimulus bill, but we need some decentralized support for local communities
Mhm.
to be able to rebuild their public places, their ways of connecting their lives. And that could even make us look at those communities that got hard hit by deindustrialization or other changes and say, we'd be a lot better off if they were strong communities.
Yeah.
Um, and that we all have a stake in this, because part of what an infectious disease shows you is that we're all vulnerable to each other's illnesses.
Yeah.
And so if we just say, hey, I'm just taking care of myself, that's sort of a recipe for potentially getting COVID
Yeah.
because, you know, you are vulnerable. And COVID doesn't respect entirely whether you're rich or not. It's true that if you are rich, you have some advantages, but not. It's worth looking at the COVID story globally. Most of the COVID action has been in pretty rich countries. It's Europe, it's the United States, it's
Mhm.
relatively well-off countries. It's also Latin America, it's also other places, but it's not that it's just the poor countries that get hit. And it's in this country, it's not just the poor neighborhoods. People in the
Right.
poor neighborhoods get worse hospitals, but people in rich neighborhoods also get sick. So, my hope would be this would make us want to renew democratic ways of solving problems so that we would solve the COVID problem, we'd solve some of the economic problem that follows from COVID, and we would be better able to address a new pandemic if one comes, or to deal with climate change or other issues down the road, which will require us to have some pretty good societal problem solving capabilities.
Yeah. Because I remember, because with the beginning of that, you were talking about how the pandemic and the quarantine has allowed light on more things to so that way we could work towards fixing them. Like for example, in your essay, you were writing about how it showed that there was a split labor market that was disproportionately towards women, minorities, and immigrants.
Yeah, well, so one of the things that's happened in the last 50 years is we've dramatically reduced our industry and manufacturing and dramatically increased the service sector and what I would call logistical work, like deliveries and warehouses and stuff, working for Costco, working for Walmart. And the that economic transformation came with two problems. We destroyed a lot of the lives of the industrial workers, and we didn't help them survive better. We didn't do enough to support them, partly because other people were making money off of it. And so, there it went. But it also produced a workforce in these service jobs that was much more minorities, much more female, much less often protected by unions than the old industrial workforce. The steel workers had unions, the tire makers had unions, the auto workers had unions, the coal miners had unions, but the healthcare aides don't have necessarily, and the Uber drivers don't have, and there's a sort of fight about that in the election in California right now. And so we shouldn't just notice the bad things that were done to manufacturing workers. We should notice the vulnerable position of the service workers. And try to figure out ways to support them for the sake of all of us, because I'll get there sooner than you, but you'll also get old and need nursing home care. And so you really don't want that to be a completely unsupported occupation.
And because I look at things in the future perspective especially with all the stuff going on, and with that too, with our.
I was being really future oriented when I said you'd eventually get old.
But I have the mindset where I look very far in the future, because I understand, especially big things that are going on with the pandemic, for example, too. It could have a very long impact on not just my kids' generation, but so on and so forth. So I see seeing these things, and especially too with trying to find solutions. Ideally, my personal feeling is that we definitely got to work towards being able to have civil discussions without alienating other people's beliefs, being able to accept it, even if you don't agree with it, just accept it and just move forward from there.
And one of the things that emergencies and crises tend to do is to speed up whatever else was going on. Sometimes, as I was saying, I hoped they make us reevaluate where we're headed, but often. So I think, a lot of the pandemic is speeding up how much we transition to using electronic communication like you and I are doing right now, whether it's social media or it's podcasts or it's webinars or all these things. And universities and schools will rely more and more on this. So this might have been a transition that would have taken place over 20, 30, 40 years, with a slow process. But the pandemic is going to speed it up. It's going to demonstrate how we can do this. It's going to lead to people thinking, oh, this is potentially a better way to do it, or a more economical way or something. And so we're going to get more use of these technologies. That only makes it more important to figure out how to use these technologies well, because we're not going to have 25 years to gradually work it out. We're going to really fast have more and more kids going to school online and so forth.
Definitely. And I think too, like my word that I was personally using in regards to like the quarantine, with it being able to accelerate and really bring attention to all these things going on, is that it's almost kind of like a great awakening. Not like a full extent, but to the extent where we're all kind of stuck at home in this quarantine, but we have this access through social media technology to really catch on to things and to see what's really going on. And we could use that as a means to improve ourselves as a whole, and not just fall into the rabbit hole of the fake news and false information.
Totally agree. And if it slows us down a little bit, makes us stay at home, maybe that gives us more chance to reflect on what our values are and where we want to go.
And I think even if in the situation, because of course I'm going to follow the idealistic way of there's no need for violence, no need for this revolutionary acts. There's the peaceful, there's a more ideal solution to all this. But like, unfortunately, as time has proven again and again, that there sometimes where just reality is going to hit no matter what. And so my mindset with how I view things, especially at this point in human history, is that even if we're going to get worse from here and we're not going to actually make that change, I believe that that'll happen sometime in the future, because as we fall, we'll rise once again.
So
And
it's still worth fighting for.
exactly, because like I say that society, especially right now, is like mankind is in their teenage years, because the fact that we're all fighting like children and we can't come to civil disagreements like adults used to be able to, that at least based off everything I got told growing up. So that's something that I definitely push forward with it as well.
So I think one thing to keep in mind is that there is no single path in which we just have progress or we just go to hell.
Hmm.
There's an ebb and a flow and an up and down and sideways turns to human history.
Hmm.
And that will happen in the future. Now, there may be a huge catastrophe, global warming or something like that, or we get hit by an asteroid or I don't know, whatever. But by and large, what will happen is we will solve some problems. Things will get better. It will turn out that there were problems with our solutions. They will need new problem solving. And sometimes we will fail to produce that.
Yeah.
And that will lead us to have problems again. So, you look at American history and you can say there's been lots of progress over the 250 years of American history.
Hmm.
You can also say there was the Civil War. There were other points that didn't look so much like progress.
Hmm.
And so we have to ask not only what's the overall course of progress, where I agree with what you're saying about that. We have to ask how good we are at picking ourselves up and starting again when we get knocked down.
Yeah. And I think people especially are only focused on that downfall. They're not looking so much as the future where we can pick it up or the possibility of that opening up. So they kind of get lost in the rabbit hole of that.
Yeah. I mean, the only long period of time in which inequality went down in American society was mostly prosperous and cooperative was the 30 years after World War II.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean you should want to have the Great Depression or want to have a war, but it does mean that when you have a calamity, you have the opportunity to try to put some new institutions in place and make them work.
And,
And they worked for a while. They didn't work forever, right? So the kind of institutions that were put in place after the war, which were not all good or not perfect in any way, were reasonably effective for 30 years or so. And then they began to run into more and more problems. And we get another era of sort of frustration with institutions, attacking institutions and so forth.
yeah.
But the moral of the story is that there won't be a straight path, and we'll have to stay awake and keep solving problems and keep figuring out which way to go. We never get to coast. We never get to say, hey, that's it. We've now got the perfect democracy. No problem.
Yeah.
We've now got the perfect economy. No problem. Things always keep changing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I certainly hope, at least with, even if we progressively get worse in the US, I really hope that it's going to reinstill the values for people that desire to improve the situation, and they just say enough is enough, and we collectively as a whole stop this and just actually fix it.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I can't support this with evidence. It's my bias, my personality almost. I'm optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Hmm.
Things might get worse before they get better, but they are going to get better in various ways. I am optimistic that we are going to find ways to rebuild democracy. Now, then the next big challenge is, having rebuilt democracy, can we solve some other problems?
Right.
With the economy or with climate change or whatever. But I am hopeful that we are near the low point on this damage to democracy problem, and things will start getting better on that.